Hello, welcome. Let us talk about sustainability as it relates to environmental legislations. The most influential regulatory agency which deals with the environmental issues and enforces environmental legislation in the United States is the Environmental Protection Agency, also often referred to as EPA. EPA was created in 1970 to coordinate the environmental agencies involved in conducting environmental research, to provide assistance in fighting pollution, and to enforce the U.S. environmental laws. It was the culmination of decades of growing protests over the deterioration of environmental quality in the United States, peaking with the publication of the Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The EPA protects Americans from significant health and environmental risks. Obviously, the same laws or similar laws might be in every single country in China, Germany, France, in Latin American countries, African continent. All countries should have similar laws that protects the local citizens as well as the global environment. The EPA can actually file civil charges against companies that violate the environmental laws. In terms of the environmental legislations, there is, first of all, the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act law was established for air quality standards, and it regulates atmospheric emissions from a variety of various sources. These maximum pollutant standards, called National Ambient Air Quality Standards, were federally mandated to protect public health as well as the environment. In the United States, individual states were directed to develop state implementation plans to meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standard by restricting emissions of criteria pollutants from stationary sources within that local state or that environment. The Clean Air Act has important implications for all businesses as well as for their relationships with their customers, particularly those industries that have a greater tendency to contribute to air pollution. There's also the Endangered Species Act, which actually provides a program for the conservation of threatened and endangered plants and animals in habitats in which they are found. The Endangered Species Act prohibits any action which results in the harm or death of a listed species that adversely affects endangered species habitat. However, the act can be a little bit controversial at times, and the concerns about restrictions and costs which are associated with the law do have some credence for many individuals and business owners. There has been some instances where actually landowners were informed that they could not develop their land because it was home to an endangered species. So if you depend on that land for your livelihood, then you cannot do business simply because an endangered species is, let's say, flying over it or mating in those environments or living in those lands. There's a Toxic Substances Control Act. So the Toxic Substances Control Act law requires reporting and testing of chemicals that tend to pose an environmental or human hazard. It restricts the use of certain chemical substances to protect human health in the environment. Actually, the EPA tracks over 75,000 industrial chemicals produced or imported into the country and can ban the manufacture and import of chemicals that pose an unrealistic level of risk. The Clean Water Act law was designed to prevent, to reduce, and to eliminate water pollutions, and it granted the EPA with the relevant authority to establish actually certain standards on an industry basis. The Clean Water Act amended the Federal Pollution Control Act of 1972 in the United States. The Clean Water Act law actually makes it illegal for anybody to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters without a permit from the government or relevant authorities. The Pollution Prevention Act law focuses industry, government, and public attention on reducing the amount of pollution through cost-effective changes in production, in operations, in the use of raw materials. One method of reducing pollution is to design environmentally friendly buildings, which happens to be one of the major sources of pollution around the world. Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, otherwise known as LEED, L-E-E-D, is a certification program which recognizes sustainable building practices and strategies. So it's a very good practice to get certification from LEED simply because they are obviously updated in terms of best practices, and they can recommend some really efficient ways of designing a building that could be sustainable and obviously practices that would reduce pollution of the local environment. The Food Quality Protection Act amended the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1996 in the United States. The requirement of this law included a new safety standard and reasonable certainty of no harm, which must be applied to all pesticides which are used on foods that we consume. It establishes a consistent science-based regulatory environment. It provides special protection for infants and children. It expedites approval of safer pesticides. It provides incentives for development of effective crop protection tools, and it requires periodic reevaluation of pesticide registrations and tolerances. The Energy Policy Act is actually a bill which gives tax breaks and loan guarantees to alternative energy companies like nuclear power plants, solar and wind energy, and requires utilities to comply with federal reliability standards for electricity grid. It focuses on promoting alternative forms of energy in the hopes of actually reducing or lessening U.S. dependence on foreign oil. And hopefully all countries have similar laws to make good use of natural energy. It also extended a daylight saving time by 1 month to save energy. Let us now talk a little bit more about the alternative sources of energy, like wind power, which actually holds the greatest promise for the Americans because of the Great Plains that exist, which is one of the greatest sources of wind energy in the world. So the wind power could meet as much as 20% of the United States energy needs. Despite the roadblocks such as the outdated national power grid, many experts believe that the U.S. will be a wind power hotspot in the future. And this should provide a lot of opportunities for many small and big businesses locally in the U.S., but also globally that can support this wind power for almost 340 million people in the U.S.'s population. There's also the geothermal power. Some advantages associated with this energy source includes the fact that geothermal energy provides a constant source of heat. It is more dependable than the alternative energy sources. It emits fewer carbon emissions than coal, and despite high initial costs, those who use geothermal power do report savings on overall energy costs. So you may have to pay a little bit more today, but you do save long-term costs. Some disadvantages of geothermal include the fact that this type of energy can be expensive and drilling sites are sparse and results in high initial cost. There's the concept of solar power, which is 100% renewable energy, and it can be converted into electricity. The solar power technology remains somewhat expensive and at times inefficient compared to the traditional energy. And the infrastructure for mass production of solar power is not in place in many locations, even in developed economies. In other areas, biofuels. Some critics claim that manufacturing ethanol takes a lot of energy. It is not much more sustainable than oil, and cars are not calibrated to handle greater amounts of ethanol. Ethanol in the United States is actually made from corn, with critics citing increased food prices and sustainability as major causes for concern. Scientists are investigating nowadays grass and algae as a source of biofuels because they're non-edible. There's hydropower, which is a very powerful renewable energy source with the ability to decrease greenhouse gas emissions as well as air pollution if they're used properly. Hydropower is the largest form of renewable energy, and a major downside is the destruction of wildlife and possibly human habitat. There's also nuclear power, which is pollution-free and cost-competitive, but it remains somewhat controversial due to safety concerns for workers in the environment and as well as the people who live in that environment. Nuclear power has greatly reduced France's emissions as well as Japan's, yet it is controversial because of the safety concerns. Some of you might remember the nuclear reactors that were damaged in Japan after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that followed it, as well as you might remember or read about the Chernobyl disaster, which happened in Ukraine during the mid-1980s, and thousands of people's lives were unfortunately lost as a result of these disasters. Besides the tsunami and the earthquake, which caused thousands of people to lose their lives in Japan during 2011, we also have another example, and that is the Chernobyl disaster. So this occurred in 1986 in Ukraine, and at that time the radioactive material dropped in the nuclear power plant, and the leaders and their employees kept it a secret because they wanted to experiment with a new way of doing things. So they took a little bit too much risk, which unfortunately caused this accident. The disaster harmed the environment, killed and injured thousands of people, and even today, many people cannot live in the Chernobyl plant. The India Bhopal disaster is another one which took place during 1984 in Bhopal, India. Safety devices were not adequate and the gas spilled through the plant vents. The disaster killed and injured thousands of people again, and global leaders should be responsible for ensuring that all of the subsidiaries of their organizations and their operations have high safety standards. They should not take too much risk. So every operation should be sustainable, should be efficient, but obviously there's no risk that is worth taking when people's lives are on the line. One must be very, very careful and very cautious. In every country, every nation, every life is a life worth saving. Therefore, doesn't matter whether you're dealing in a country that has strict regulations or a country that does not have too many regulations, you need to be socially responsible and make decisions that go above and beyond the laws to save lives and to be safe and responsible for everything that happens in your operations. Good luck being sustainable professionals, sustainable employees, sustainable managers, sustainable owners, and sustainable citizens of your city, your state, your country, in this planet. Remember that ethical behavior is a skill, and so is sustainability behaviors. It is a skill for everyone. Everyone in the organization needs to police, evaluate, and improve their sustainability muscles in thinking critically towards how they can be sustainable in every single task and every single department and throughout the organization. Everyone should be empowered to manage and guide effectively in their day-to-day tasks in departmental operations. Good luck.